I was going to wait for the town clock to chime, but it's been a little unreliable. Can everyone hear me, or do I need the bullhorn? You're going to need it? Okay. All right, I'll definitely need it. All right. All right, then. I've never used one of these before. Hopefully it works out all right. It might be the only thing that works out well today. By the way, if you love the tour at 10, the one at 2 is the exact same thing. It's not going to get any better. So we're going to do a walking tour of downtown Greencastle. We're going to hit some of the historic highlights. And I will say this, all of American history has been played out in Greencastle in a microcosm. Going all the way back to the colonial period. I strongly advise you to visit the Conning Institute over at Welsh Run. First of all, for nothing else, it really gets in the detail about what colonial life was like. There's a strong emphasis on the French Indian War, which I cannot get into today, but I'd love to. I'd love to get into the whole colonial period. But we're actually going to start with the founding of Greencastle. Can anybody tell me what year that was in? That's right, 1742. Very good. What's it? What's it? It was, yes. Thank you. That's the year. Yes. It was actually, yeah, 1782. 1741, by the way, was when Antrim Township was founded as a political entity. And interestingly enough, I always like to think of it this way. Think of Antrim Township as the donut, and Greencastle is the hole in the middle, which I think should actually be on the signs you're driving to town. Greencastle, the hole in the middle. And the township is about 69.5 square miles. The borough is about 1.6 square miles. And intertwined history, of course. The mayor and I like to say it's Greencastle Antrim, not just Greencastle and Antrim. That's why I say Greencastle School District. Greencastle. Hey Gary, how are you? Good. Great. Now I have people from work here, but relatives. Oh man, I better not suck. Anyhow, so people are thinking, oh, too late for that, Bill. But anyhow, so yeah, and the Chamber of Commerce, Greencastle Antrim. Of course, it's all one community. Of course, the downtown in any community is a vital part. That's why so much of what we do is focused on downtown. It's the first thing people see when they visit a town. And so much of our history actually took place within walking distance of the downtown, or even within the downtown, including its founding. And it all started with about 300 acres. It belonged to various people over the years, until eventually went to William Allison, and then left it to his son John. John actually had plans to develop the area. John, by the way, grew up here. He was actually educated by the local Presbyterian minister. Presbyterians, by the way, were the first congregation to build a church here in Greencastle, have a physical structure. Lots of different groups were here religiously. Of course, German Reformed. You can visit their cemetery down the street. By the way, the German Reformed Church no longer exists. It was incorporated and became part of the United Church of Christ, which is why when you look at the sign, it says it's cared for by the United Church of Christ. But do visit that cemetery sometime right down the street from here. And then, of course, the Presbyterians were the first ones to build a church. They built it over by Moss Spring. They wanted it near water for a couple of reasons. First, we all need water, right? We need to bathe, we need to drink. But why else would a church want to be near water? Anyway, baptisms, yes, very good. Yes, indeed. Very good. By the last count, there were over 20 different denominations, or different congregations, sorry, because some denominations have more than one representation here, but there are over 20 different congregations here in Greencastle Antrim. I'm done. It's time to go home. Right, so, this is where it all started, right here. Now, John Allison, as I said, inherited the land from his father, 300 acres. He had planned on developing it early, and then something happened, a huge event called the American Revolution. And John Allison actually served as a colonel, close personal friend of George Washington. In fact, we'll talk about how when George Washington came through here during the Whiskey Rebellion, we'll get that in a moment. But John Allison had plans to develop this area. They were kind of delayed by the war. He came back to his hometown. He said, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take this land my father left me. We're going to divide it into equal-sized lots. So that 300 acres became 246 lots. This was lot number 1 right here, by the way. This was Allison's Tavern. And during its history, this spot has been home to a lot of taverns, hotels. In fact, in 1850, it was the Union Hotel, and we'll talk about that later. But this was Allison's lot number 1. Everything else came out from here. There were at the time 2 streets. The first one was known as the King's Highway. It basically ran from the Susquehanna River down to the Potomac. In other words, from the capital of Pennsylvania down to Baltimore. In other words, it connected the 2 colonies, which were both founded for groups that were facing religious persecution in England. At the time, of course, you had the Quakers seeking refuge here in Pennsylvania, and you had Roman Catholics seeking refuge in Maryland. which by the way was not named after Our Lady Mary. It was actually named after Queen Maria Theresa, who actually financed the founding of the colony. Anyhow, back to Pennsylvania. So he had plans to develop this area over 300 acres, 246 lots. And what they did was they took the existing roads. There were two. One was called the King's Highway, as I said. That was, of course, maintained by the government, colonial government. And then the other was kind of hacked out of the wilderness, as most roads were, by the colonists. And that would be what is roughly Baltimore Street today. The other, of course, the King's Highway is what is roughly Carlisle Street today. And they built 4 other streets. And these wise men, our founding fathers, came up with brilliant names for the streets. They were North Street, which is now Madison Street. Can you guess what Washington Street was called? It was East Street. And then South Street was Franklin Street, which is where I live, and I'll get to that in a moment. And then West Street was Jefferson Street. Yes, very good. And so yeah, all of that was laid out. So you had 6 roads, and really that was the nucleus of the town. 246 lots. Anybody know how much those lots cost? $8 a piece. And everybody, even though you weren't too far from the square, no matter where you were, or the diamond as they called it then, you wanted to be as close as possible because that was the center of everything. So they actually wanted to make it fair, so there was a drawing. You paid $8 for your lot. The lots were numbered, put on a numbered piece of the paper. You reached into a hat, you pulled out your lot number, and that was yours. Now, if you go down, say, a street like Franklin Street, one of the things you're going to find is even to this day, a lot of those lots still have the same appearance they had then. For example, the house I live in at 41 West Franklin Street was originally a log cabin. And instead of tearing that log cabin down, they built around it, which is not uncommon. So our kitchen was the log cabin that was built when that lot was laid out in 1782. The rest of the house was added to it over the years. And what you find is long, narrow lots. So you had your house up front. In the back, you sometimes had your kitchen, which was separate from the rest of the house, because accidents were known to happen in kitchens. You had an outhouse, which, by the way, we still have. And it's a 2-seater, which I think is very romantic. and by the way, when you hear about archaeological digs and they go to old homesteads, one of the first places they look for is where the outhouse was, for a couple of reasons. First, when you sit down, right, to take a number 2, think about all the things right at your own home. How many times do things fall out of your pocket? Right? Now, if you're sitting on your toilet today, right, they're going to fall on the floor. But back then, they fell into the hole in your outhouse. The other thing, too, is you also use your outhouse as your trash dump. And you would often move the outhouse from one location to another. So a prime place to go if you're an archaeologist to go to where the outhouses were, dig those up, you're going to find all these really cool artifacts. And the poop's all gone now, too, so you're in good shape. The other thing you also had room for a garden. You had room for whatever business you ran. You might have been a local blacksmith, perhaps you had a woodworking shop. And then you also had room for some of the animals you might raise. So all of that started here, those 246 lots. Now, I mentioned George Washington coming through here. Let's take a walk. We're going this way. Doodly-doo, doodly-doo, doodly-doo. I will speak a little slower, yes. Is this better? Good. So I had so many people tell me what I should do today. One of them was my wife, who kept reminding me, remember there's a photograph, it's 11:30. Sit down this way. By the way, before we go any further, can everybody see down there in the corner WRGG? Yep. That's our local radio station. You can find local personalities like myself there every morning on the morning show, from 6 to 9. You can also find people like Casey Taylor. Yes, that's what we're recording for the station.
I'm going to drop my water bottle off too. Yeah. No, she won't. My girls think that
I got in on a cancellation
tradition. You're about lucky.
One of the cool things about history and archaeology is you never know what you're going to discover, and it's some of the coolest and most surprising places. We're going to come around the corner here. All this works for so little payoff. Wait till everyone's here. One of the really cool things about a town, any town or any city, as you study its history, you see changes in architecture. You see, for example, wooden buildings, being replaced by brick buildings and so on, stone. But you also see a lot of really cool things. Like I ask my kids, why are there so many, places around town where people have garages that look like barns? Well, because once upon a time, those were barns. But over here, all of this, for years, was covered up with thickets and brush, and so they cleared it all out. And can anybody tell me, as you look at that concrete, what those rings are for?
Horses.
Yes, exactly! They were tying up your horses when you came into town. Isn't that cool? Right here in Greencastle. All right, let's go around the corner. Let's talk a little bit about George Washington. See if we can see him. That's how we're going to look at him, folks.
And that's why he built that after 1960. I read the article in the paper that said there were 17 things. I went back and counted them. We got 16, but then the whole one was cut off. Oh, so it was 17. Wow.
So we already mentioned Colonel Allison serving in the Revolution, and coming back here, selling this town. In the early days of the Republic, we were governed by what were known as the Articles of Confederation, which allowed for strong state governments and a weak central government. And that was tested several times, including by a rebellion in Massachusetts after a revolution led by a farmer named Shea. He was not pleased with the fact that the federal government, of course, was taxing people to pay for the war, so he rebelled. The governor of Massachusetts turned to the federal government and asked for assistance. They said, well, according to our governing documents, we have no power to assist you. So that's one of the reasons that the Articles of Confederation were done away with and replaced with the Constitution. The Constitution, of course, led to a stronger federal government, and one of the first tests of the federal government was a similar sort of rebellion, except it was over whiskey. Keep in mind that at the time, Pennsylvania was actually the frontier. It's hard to believe now, but you're actually here in frontier land. And there was a lot going on here that was kind of out of the eyes of the federal government, including the fact that whiskey was being used as a commodity and actually used as a currency, especially on the frontier in the western part of Pennsylvania. So one of the first things the federal government did was it taxed whiskey. And it was actually the first time the federal government actually ever taxed a domestic product. And that was whiskey. Of course, people in Western Pennsylvania weren't happy with that, so when the tax collectors came to collect the tax, they refused to pay it, and then they started harassing the tax collectors and so on, turned into an armed rebellion, and so President Washington, along with his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, the guy from the musical, they came through town with actually an army that was raised by local governors, with Washington and Hamilton at the head of it, to suppress the whiskey rebellion. In the end, of course, once everybody knew they were coming, the whole thing sort of disbanded. Only a few of the leaders were tried, and then those that were actually, there were two that were actually convicted. They were later pardoned, In fact, the pardoning actually came when they were deemed to be criminally insane. That was the legal technicality they used. But as George Washington came through this area to go to western Pennsylvania to crush the whiskey rebellion, he actually stopped here in this building, known as the Mansion House. Known as different things over the years. You'll find a lot of buildings had different names over the years. But this is where actually had breakfast. Robert McCullough, this was known as the Mansion House. And this is where President Washington stopped to have breakfast. All right, let's move on.
I want to know where he's eating.
It might still be. Yeah. Gilmore Girls episode. I don't know. They just music musicians start
So not only do I have friends from work and relatives here, but also friends from trivia, who I'm sure are taking notes. All right, so of course the next great event, and so many great events happened throughout. As I said earlier, all of American history is played out a microcosm in the Greencastle area. I want to talk a little bit about the Civil War. There's so many precedents for it, so many events that lead to it. I always said, as a history major at college, I always like the idea that there's no single event that stands alone. Think of it as like, you throw a stone into the water, you get that ripple effect, right? And so many different stones being thrown at so many different times, all those ripples kind of interconnect like a big Venn diagram. But when it comes to the Civil War, of course, a great part of it, of course, took place in this area, and we're going to get into, my goodness, we're going to get into quite a bit of it. And of course, central to our understanding of Pennsylvania's role in the Civil War, of course, is the Battle of Gettysburg. And as a prelude to that, of course, we had Confederate armies march through here. And by the way, the Civil War, first time the Union Army actually used trains to deploy troops. And among those troops was actually a young man named Corporal Ryle, who was actually from Philadelphia, served in the 1st New York Cavalry. And as the Confederates came through here, over by the Fleming farm, you'll find on Route 11, still part of the Fleming family, by the way, you'll find the monument there to Corporal Ryle. His distinction is he was the first Union soldier killed north of the Mason-Dixon line. Who asked me to go slower? Was that good? All right. Yes, he was the first Union soldier killed north of the Mason-Dixon line. And then what happened was, the men he was with, of course, fled. The Confederates then, who were desperate for clothing and shoes, actually stripped his body, took his shoes, took his boots, then left him in the field. The folks in town went, retrieved his body. Originally they buried it over by the Lutheran church because they have a cemetery there. But then they dug up the body, reinterred it under the monument that's in his honor over on Route 11. If you're driving towards Chambersburg, look over on your left and you'll see that monument. And that's where he's buried. So Corporal Ryle, the first person to fall, first Union soldier fall on Union soil. Now another event that happened as Confederates came through this area, there was a young lady named, actually her name was Jenny Harris, but people called her Dolly. She lived right down the street. You can't quite see it from here, but if you turn around that corner, you'll see where, well, so many different things. When I moved here in 1992, it was Citizens Bank, which had been since like the 1920s. Susquehanna Bank at one point, now it's a church. It's also the official headquarters of Old Home Week. Right, Gary?
Headquarters.
Yes, indeed. That's my brother-in-law, Gary. He and his wife, Daphne, are the registrars. But on the north annex of what had been the bank was where the Harris family lived. They actually owned a couple of pieces of property. And of course, as General Pickett, or as I call him, Stephen Lang from Gettysburg, rode through this area, she, of course, ran outside, waving her, actually, it turned out it was her apron, but every time she was a flag, an American flag, and denouncing them all as traitors, plunderers, and so on. Because wait a minute, they came through here, they were plundering. And people were concerned about what might be done. Of course, the troops weren't happy to hear all that. But what does General Pickett do? He stands up in his stirrups and salutes her. In which case, the band then started playing they started playing, anybody know what song they played? Dixie. Yeah, they started playing Dixie, yes. And then everybody cheered and went on their way. By the way, Dolly Harris is the only person from this area, the only woman from this area to have been buried with full military honors, at least for the Civil War. Now, of course, as the troops are coming through this area, they're ultimately heading to the Battle at Gettysburg, July 1st to 3rd, 1863. And as some of them came through this area, of course, you notice this historical marker. Captain Elric Dahlgren commanded a detachment of Union cavalry that made a surprise attack on a larger force of Confederate cavalry on this square, July 2nd, 1863. Important papers for General Lee were taken from the men who were captured. Those important papers, by the way, were a response to Lee's request to have troops taken out of Richmond to support his campaign in Gettysburg. The only problem was the folks in Richmond were concerned the capital was going to fall if they left it undefended. Those papers actually don't lead no reinforcements for coming. Of course, by this point, it's 2 days into the battle, so it really didn't matter. But what does Captain Dahlgren do? He takes that satchel, right, with those papers, gets on his horse, and he rides all night till he gets to Gettysburg, so he can deliver those papers to Union leaders. And of course, what he does then is he stays and he fights at Gettysburg. Then he takes part in a number of engagements after that. Of course, everybody knows the second largest battle in Pennsylvania after Gettysburg was Monterey Pass, as the Confederates passed through there. By the way, you can visit a wonderful site there. The other battle took place just south of the Mason-Dixon line in Hagerstown, where they actually fought, like, think of the old Stalingrad, Leningrad, Soviets and the Nazis fighting like door to door, street to street. That's how it was in Hagerstown in that battle. And there were a couple of prominent names there. One of them was Albert Dahlgren, who got shot in the right leg and had to go home to recuperate. Home, by the way, was in Washington, D.C., where his father was an admiral. Not only was his father an admiral, but he also ran the Navy shipyard in D.C., so he was a very prominent person in D.C. It was not uncommon for President Lincoln to visit their house. It was not uncommon for Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of War, members of the cabinet, Congress to visit their house. So he went home to recuperate. By the way, somebody else prominent who was at both Gettysburg and Hagerstown was a guy by the name of Custer. Not only was he embarrassed years later, but he was also embarrassed in Hagerstown when the Confederates stole his entire personal wagon with all of his personal clothes and effects, his papers. They made a great to-do about putting all that on display. But anyhow, so what happens to Captain Ulrich Dahlgren is while he's recuperating, he is approached by a general named Kilpatrick. And Mr. Kilpatrick, he was known as Kill Cavalry for a couple of reasons. First, he led cavalry, and Kill was part of his first name, but also he was very reckless. And he came to Dahlgren, who was eager to get back in the war, but of course missing a leg, with this idea that they were going to plan a raid known as the Kilpatrick-Dahlgren raid, and they were going to go into Richmond, Virginia, and the idea was that they were going to go and liberate northern prisoners of war who were being held in prison camps like Libby around Richmond. Of course, everybody knew how poorly these men were being treated, so of course he signed up for this. It turned out to be a disaster. They were all killed, and in fact, Dahlgren's body was actually taken and mutilated after he was dead. And it was actually a Union spy living in Richmond at the time who had his body exhumed and then sent back north to his father. But the other thing about it is, Confederate newspapers in the South, claimed that they found on his body what we refer to now as a kill list. And they identified all the members of the Confederate cabinet as well as the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, as intended victims. The idea, according to Confederate newspapers, was they were going to go and burn Richmond and kill all these men. Of course, the Union government, Union newspapers all said this was incorrect, that this was dependent on his body, and none of this was true. But what happened, though, was it led a number of people who are either Southerners or Southern sympathizers to come up with their own kill list, which, of course, had Abraham Lincoln at the top of the list, as well as the members of his cabinet. And a member of that group was John Wilkes Booth. And that was the impetus for the plan to kill not only Lincoln, but the members of his cabinet as well. Of course, in the end, they only succeeded with the killing of Lincoln. Come on, let's move on. Well, new to me, yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to get retired.
Yeah. Well, good to see you. Good to see you too.
Yeah, he's very friendly.
I should went to your house. Do you just wanna? Are we going for lunch then? Yeah. You just wanna drive further? I just parking still. That's a yeah. That's fine. I can walk. I don't mind walking. I just am a strip.
Yeah, but like talking trucks away.
I feel like the Pied Piper. Although I'm liking that story, I will return your children. How many of you know, by the way, that's how the story ends. He actually takes their children, because the Pied Piper of Hamelin, the legend says, was hired to take the rats out of Hamelin. When the people didn't pay him, he then took their children. Pretty dark ending to that story. Right. I mentioned before that at one point in time, or many points in time, there are different buildings that be used for different reasons. And I mentioned how lot number 1, Allison's Tavern, was in 1850 the Union Hotel. And if you go through the old records, you look at the registry, there was a man who signed his name as I.M. Smith. And we know that John Brown, of course, who led the raid on Harper's Ferry, I mentioned earlier, the ripple effect, one event and how they overlap. Well, of course, one of the events that led to the Civil War was the attack on Harper's Ferry and the Federal Arsenal, led by John Brown. And it is believed that he was the I.M. Smith who checked into the Union Hotel. We know he was very active in this area. In fact, he lived at the Rittner boarding house in Chambersburg for some time while he was planning the raid on Harper's Ferry. In fact, he met with Frederick Douglass, the prominent abolitionist who had been a slave himself, who later on, by the way, served as the Marshal of D.C. after the war. But Frederick Douglass wanted to meet with John Brown just to find out, but he also was aware of John Brown's reputation for being kind of crazy. He had been involved in something called Bleeding Kansas out west. It was kind of like a mini Civil War prior to the actual Civil War. And so he agreed to meet with him, but only at night outside the town or the quarry. But as I said, yeah, John Brown was very active in this area, and I strongly believe he actually stayed at the Union Hotel. Now, one of the things you'll find as towns grow and prosper and money comes in and you see industry, one of the really cool things is you go through this town, you look at some of the older buildings, you'll see a lot of them have names of business on the side, no longer in business, but you're going to find houses now that were garment shops in one place, or garment manufacturing locations. You're going to find places that were tool shops that are now homes. You're going to find railroad stations that are now homes as well, because there were actually a number of times when the railroad actually came through town. You can actually see, if you look on the square, some of the remnants of some of those tracks. You can also see where the it's really cool. You had trains that connected here to the Chambersburg and so on. But anyhow, I really wish, though, the train still ran through town when I used to come down here from Canada to visit my wife before we were married. In other words, the first time I came down was on a Greyhound, and I had 5 days for Easter break, and I spent one on a Greyhound coming down, one on a Greyhound going out. By the way, when I got on the Greyhound, I'm from Montreal, Canada. When I got on the Greyhound in Montreal, the bus was packed, right? We went from Montreal to New York, and then from New York to Philadelphia on another packed bus, and then from Philadelphia to Harrisburg on another packed bus. And when I got on the bus in Harrisburg for the last leg of the journey, after all these packed buses, it was me and the driver. And I said, whoa, whoa. And I sat down, he closed the door, and we laughed. And I said, whoa, what about everyone else? And he said, what everyone else? He said, I'm surprised you got on. And I said, he said, where are you going? I said, Greencastle. And he responded with, Greencastle? And I said, you seem surprised. And he said, I am. He said, in all the years I've been driving this route, I've taken a lot of people from there. I've just never taken anyone to there. So right off the bat, I started having all these visions, deliverance. I'm hearing banjos playing. And I said to the guy, I said, what's wrong with this town? He goes, oh, nothing. It's a beautiful town, as I came to find out. He goes, it's just not the kind of destination. People don't call Greyhound and say, can I please go to Greencastle? Which explains why, by the way, Greyhound no longer comes to Greencastle. At the time, now, I didn't know where I was or where I was going. I just knew I was going to end up in Greencastle. But we stopped on every small town from Harrisburg to Greencastle. And every time we'd get out, whatever the local bus station was, usually a local diner or a little something on the square. Here was Mr. Reeves' place on the square. And the driver would get out, he'd go in, come out by himself, close the door, we'd drive another 10, 15 minutes, he'd get out, go inside, come out by himself. I'm like, man, if you just stopped going in all these places, we'd get there a lot faster. But anyhow, so here we are. We are standing in front, I've talked about, of course, buildings, right? On this site, there was a building originally at one time called the Old Town Hall. And it plays a central part, of course, in the history of Greencastle, because for the longest time, it was actually the official headquarters of Old Home Week, which is what we are currently celebrating. And by the way, speaking of Old Home Week, can everybody tell me who's on the badge and the t-shirt? Anyone? Carl's Drugstore, yes. And by the way, when Adam Carl came to Greencastle, of course, started his business in 1825, you can see the location right there. And it stayed in the Carl family until 1974 when Frank Irvin, that's Irvin with an E, took over. Irvin was the first the first owner of Carl's Drugstore not be a member of the Carl family. Now his father had worked as an assistant to the Carls, and of course he had worked there as well. 1974, he bought the business. Of course, 1999, he moved out of their longtime location over to the current location over on Route 11. This thing's heavy. All right, so this originally, what I'd really like you to do is, I'm so glad they started doing work here because they have the pictures up. You can see what the building used to look like. This was a beautiful building. It was built in 1871, and it had 3 stories. The bottom floor was offices. The second floor was actually an auditorium. And at the time, of course, in 1871, all the prominent minstrel shows came through here. Of course, Philip Bear started off for the professor as a member of minstrel shows. Sometimes even medicine shows, which are kind of like huckster minstrel shows. Hey, buy this, it'll cure everything. But so this Old Town Hall, and then that auditorium eventually became the town's first movie theater. And then on the 3rd floor, you had the Knights of Pythias who met in the front room, and then the back room was where the Greencastle band met, so they always had a permanent home. Of course, it went through a number of different owners, and in fact, it stopped being a movie theater when over across the street, which now is B Street. Of course, not only do buildings go through different uses, but also different names. I remember when I lived here, it was the Antrim House, but at one time it was the Hotel Greencastle. Originally, it was a 2-story wooden structure with a pen in the back. It was a very prominent place for people to go when they wanted to come here and buy land or buy cattle, and oftentimes they would bring the cattle or horses they wanted to trade to the hotel with them and keep them in the back of the pen. And of course, all that was replaced with the current building built back in 1904 as the Hotel Greencastle, and eventually part of the addition, as you can see, what is now Gems, was the Gem Theater. And when that theater was built, which by the way, my in-laws actually saw the movie Giant there. Anybody familiar with Giant? George Stevens film? Yeah, don't watch it. It's just like a 3-hour-long soap opera. My buddy and I were really getting into movies. We're like, oh yeah, we're gonna watch all the classics. I fell asleep 20 minutes into it. I don't care if James Dean and Rock Hudson are both in it. I'm falling asleep. It was just a soap opera, but anyhow. So yeah, so the Gem Theater went in there, and that put this theater out of business. And then eventually this building became offices and apartments. Until sadly, 2005, when the then current owner, who was doing an amazing job of renovating it, of course ended up, losing the building to a fire. And of course now it's being replaced with an open space for the town. So things like Old Home Week and Heritage Christmas, sidewalk gates can all have a function here, kind of similar to what they do in the market area up in Waynesboro. So I'm very grateful to the people of this town and the people of the borough for getting behind that as well. So another building we have to talk about when we talk about the history of Greencastle. Let's head back down to the square. We're going to talk about, anybody guess? Anybody guess? The town clock. Let's head down that way.
So how did you say the Gem's name came into being originally?
It was a theater called the Gem.
But where'd they get that name?
I don't know. I guess they just thought it was a good name.
Because we were wondering where they got that Gems. And I thought,
Yeah, it's a throwback to the, and then I think the owner's granddaughter named Gemma. So we're playing that as well.
oh, this owner.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Right at all. Oh, sure.
One detail.
Yeah.
Where Corporal Ryle is buried, it's no longer in the fountain.
I thought so. I wasn't sure about that.
Well,
Thank you.
I was in the family.
Oh, okay.
We sold
I wasn't
6
sure
years
about
ago.
that. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll that. Yeah. I wasn't certain about that. I wasn't quite sure where to look.
Yeah. No,
Thank
we
you.
did have it up until 6 years ago.
Oh, very good. Thank you. It's still a working farm, though, right?
Oh, yes.
So what's really cool is when you look at industry, when you look at finance, you look at business, you look at manufacturing, all of that, right? It's here in Franklin County and Greencastle. You look at someone like John L. Grove, who basically invented 2 industries, right? He invented the crane industry, he invented the mammoth industry, all that right here, which is amazing. But you also see the history of finance here as well. Some of the oldest businesses in Franklin County are actually banks. First National Bank was one of the first in this area to actually set up a building. And that was over in that corner in 1871. By the way, one of the oldest businesses in this area, a newspaper, our local newspaper. By the way, I think the Echo Pilot, how many of you were at the pageant last night? I think the Echo Pilot got more mentions than anybody else. Although you'll notice in the program, Greg Hoover playing Greg Hoover.
Yes.
Got his name mentioned twice, yes. But the Echo Pilot was actually founded back in 1849. Not originally as a town newspaper, but actually as a newsletter for another religious group that settled here briefly. There was actually on the outskirts of town, Antrim Township, a Mormon colony. And they actually founded it with the Conococheague Herald, is what it was called originally. Of course, eventually they left the area to take part in that great westward trek that the Mormons undertook to end up in Utah, and eventually became the Echo Pilot newspaper. And it's been in business since 1849, still in business, still a weekly newspaper. And interestingly enough, they're no longer a local newspaper, because both it, the Public Opinion, which is also one of the other oldest businesses in Franklin County, and the Mercersburg Journal, another. Actually, the Mercersburg Journal is still independent, but the Public Opinion, Echo Pilot, and Record Herald, of course, up in Waynesboro, were all bought up by the same company, which is why, by the way, when you read it, you see the same news in all of them. But anyhow, so yeah, 1849, 1871, First National Bank was building that building, and the people in town said, wouldn't it be nice if we could put a clock tower on top? By the way, it is not owned by the bank. It's actually owned by the people of Greencastle, and it's maintained by the borough. So in 1871, the people in town said, we would like to have a clock tower, kind of like a symbol, right? Because look at all those towns. How many times in movies, for example, like Back to the Future, right? Where they meet in Town Square, right? They've got the clock tower. So we wanted a clock tower here. So in 1871, as the building was being constructed, they went to the board of directors of the First National Bank of Greencastle and said, would you mind if we paid to put a clock tower on top? The only thing they had to do, they had to go back into the plans for the building and make sure the roof, at least in that area, was strong enough to support the clock. And so it was actually a private donation drive by the people of Greencastle. It cost $800. 500 of it was for the tower and clock, and the other 300 was for the bell. And so to this day, while the bank, of course, has gone through many names, it was the First National Bank of Greencastle forever. Then, of course, it became Tower, and then merged with Susquehanna, which had been Citizens, which anyhow, then it ended up buying out by Truist. But today, to this day, of course, the clock tower is actually owned by the people of Greencastle who paid the $800 to have it built. And the borough still maintains it. So there you go, folks. I said it would be about 45 minutes to an hour. It was about 40 minutes. Hopefully I didn't steal too much of your time. And if you liked it enough, come back for the second one or tell your friends. So thank you so much. And remember, folks, there is so much you can explore here. As I said before, all of this nation's wonderful, beautiful history with all its complexity, all of its nuances, all of its many layers, is all played out here in our own town. Going all the way back to the colonial period, right up to the present time. You're talking about, the colonial time, you're talking about the French and Indian War, you're talking about the Revolution, you're talking about the Industrial Revolution, all that played out here, the Civil War, and so on, right up to the present day. Check out these sites, check out the history, and never, ever, ever, ever take any of this for granted. And by all means, think about your role in all of this, in your town, in its history, and in its future. Thank you so much.